happy Friday. It's always great to have people attending these. It takes a little bit of time to put them together, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join, whether it's early in the morning over on the West Coast or later in the evening if you're further in Europe or Asia or anywhere east of Vermont. So with that being said, I'll jump into the webinar. Again, thank you for joining me. Happy Friday, and welcome. I'm still kind of getting used to this whole Zoom webinar platform, so please forgive me if I'm a little slow to catch up to speed with where we were with our previous platform. As you can tell from our slide here, this webinar will be focused on applying image filters to your image data to help improve your reconstruction accuracy in NeuroLucida 360 and in VesaLucida 360. My goal today is to provide you with an overview of what the filters are, how they work, and when to apply them to your image data. Before we get into the details of this module and feature, I'd like to just put the reminder out there, as always, that the success of today's webinar is in part due to the questions that you all come up with. And since this is a relatively new application for me and for many of you probably, I think it would be helpful to just go over how we can submit those questions. So as you come up with a question, if they develop along the way, please feel free to send them in and I'll do my best to answer them. It's as easy as finding this Q&A kind of panel or button in the Zoom webinar panel. It'll pop up this question and answer section. And as you type them in, I'll see them in real time. Please forgive me, I am working on 2 monitors, so it might take a second just to see it pop up, but I'll do my best to try and stay on top of those as they come in. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded just like others have been, and a link will be sent to the email that you provided in the sign up. So with all that being said, I think now is a great time to jump into the webinar. The program I'm going to be running on today is NeuroLucida 360, but everything that you see today in this program is also applicable to VesaLucida 360. So just because we're in one does not mean it's not applicable to the other. That double negative is just, it is what it is. It'll work in both programs as you see it. So where can we find the batch filter module and feature? If we look in the main window here, under the image tab, the batch filter icon will be found under the tools section here. When we click on it, it'll launch the kind of external window for batch filtering. And we have a couple options to start, but the first is to add images to your filter. So when we click that, it'll launch another window and we can select from our computer and we'll choose the 2 images that we'd like to start with. In this case, I'm going to choose 2 images that we tend to montage together. And this will be a good demonstration of our first filter, which is the projection filter. Once the images have been selected from your computer location, you'll see that location here under the image column. The filter column is blank because we still have to select which filter we'd like to apply, and that is done here under the configuration column. To select the filter, just click on this wrench icon. It will show the input file. The output location is blank because we have yet to choose that filter that we're applying. And so now we'll go ahead and choose that projection filter. Here we can see where the filter is going to save the final image to. And then we can choose a compression ratio of our liking. And then here, the only settings we have for the projection filter are whether you're working with a maximum intensity projection or minimum intensity. Because these are fluorescent images, we're going to choose that maximum intensity, and I'm going to apply it to both images that we've chosen for this filter. Here we can see again that the filter is now under the projection filter, and the status says waiting. When it says waiting, it's not because it's working, it's waiting for us to make the final choice of what we'd like to do, which is to click start to run the filters through. Now this is going to happen very quickly. The status will change to running and then it will be completed. Right here we can see that both are under the completed category, I guess. And that means that when we return to our original location, or when we return to the saved location, we can find those there with the underscore projection at the end of the file name. So I'll close this batch filtering module. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to open up the original files to show you that we were working with image stacks to begin with. Whoops, technical difficulty there. I'm going to open up the original 2 montage images that we were working with. Open them in the program. We have this montage 1 JPX. I'll click load. And because we're loading 2 images, we will get the message that NeuroLucida 360 can only open 1 image stack at a time in the 3-dimensional window. That's okay. I'm just doing this to show that we are indeed working with an image stack rather than a projection like we've applied the filter to create. When I close this 3D environment, I can go into the 2D environment, and I'm just going to quickly move one of these images over, zoom out just a bit so we can see. And as I use my page up and page down keys on my keyboard, we can see that both images are being run through their individual planes. So here we can see with the page up and page down key that we are indeed working with a stack. And so when we applied that image filter, I'm just going to hide these once by using the eyeball icon in our image organizer tool. I'm going to once again select my images on my off screen, and I'm going to drag and drop those in. So now we can see montage 1 underscore projection. That means we're working with our filtered image. And right away we can see, I'm just going to move this image over slightly. We can see that we're now working with the image data that we had applied that filter to. By using that page up and page down key, we're no longer moving through a plane because we've applied that projection filter to create a single image, 1 plane, and that is our projection. So if you need to apply a projection to multiple images, whether you're making a minimum or maximum intensity projection, rather than having to do that within the trace ribbon, or sorry, the image and changing it to max or minimum on an image by image basis, we can apply that filter to a number of images at once, and then you don't have to kind of individually select that. That is when you would want to use that projection filter. That one's more of a at your discretion type of thing. It doesn't necessarily increase the accuracy of the tracing, but it will make a nice picture if you need to do that from your 2D image data, or if you're looking to simply montage it in a 1 or 2-dimensional space. That is a nice and efficient way to do that as well. It's a very good time saver. The next image that will run through the batch filter, I'm just going to close this, is going to be our in vivo filter. If you're working with in vivo imaging, this is an excellent way to apply a kind of movement correction, if you will. So before I run the filter here, I want to show you what we're going to be doing. Once again, I'm going to drag and drop my image from the off screen. I'm going to apply the scaling because the metadata does not have the scaling written to it. So now when I open this image, we can see that we have a nice image stack that's been acquired for us. We can see individual spines along the branches, which is fantastic. But as we rotate in the sort of YZ dimension, we can see that there is some shifting going on in the head of the spines as well as the branches. And furthermore, to kind of push that further and give a better example, when we look in 2D, we can see the individual branches moving. Because this is an in vivo image, the animal is alive, so there is the heartbeat, there's breathing, there's different things that happen. And one of our developers had described it as a wiggle. So as you see these branches sort of wiggle and move, it's going to increase the saturation in that axis in the 3D environment. So what it's going to do is it's potentially going to adjust the thickness and the detection of the branch, and that's going to change the detection of the spines that we're looking to create. Excuse me. So what we do when we apply this batch filter is, again, we'll return to the configuration wrench. We'll select the in vivo filter. And here I'm going to describe the settings in reverse order. When we do the in vivo filter, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a band count. The way that we describe that is, if you think of the image being broken up into horizontal bars, each one of those bars is going to be a band. And what the band count is saying is just how many horizontal bars are we creating for this image. Essentially what we're doing is with those bands, we're going to work with our maximum displacement setting here. And we're saying, almost as if it was a puzzle, how far are we seeing that shift per band? So the maximum displacement is in pixels, which means we're allowing the band to shift 10 pixels to try and match the next plane in the image stack. So as we move through the image stack, we're going to try and shift each band to match the previous location. So we're minimizing that shift. The band count will be raised or lowered depending on the amount of movement that you're seeing. So the default is at 16. If there's a lot of movement, you can bump that up slightly. There's not much of a reason to go much higher than 16 unless there's significant movement. It's even recommended to go a little lower sometimes so you don't have as large of shifts, and it will take a little bit less time to apply that filter. Anyway, when I go ahead, click OK, I can click Start, but because this is a demonstration, we've already run the filter. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here and just put it in the program as it's been filtered. I'll slightly move it over so we can see both of them in conjunction. And in just a second, we can look at a side-by-side view and see that both images, the one on the right will be our original, and the one on the left will be our filtered image. And now as we move through the image stack, let me try that again. Now as we move through the image stack, we should see, let me just change this once more. My apologies, everyone. We'll go to Home. Okay. In conjunction, it's a little off on the right, but we can see that the movement is happening on the right. And then on the left, the movement is substantially kind of subdued. So we don't have as much wiggling going on in the left image as we do in the right. So now as we look in the 3D environment, we can see that there's much less of that kind of wiggling. And if we look at the spine heads and the branches themselves, they're much more kind of uniform and true to what we would be seeing if it weren't in vivo. So this filter is going to help remedy some of the movement that can occur during the acquisition process. The next image filter that I'll start to look at with you is the Morphologic closing filter. Here, I'm just going to bring in our in-house image data to start. Excuse me. And when we go to the batch filter, I'll select it from the computer, vessel 1 and 2. All of these, by the way, have been done prior to the demonstration. So please forgive me if it looks like I'm kind of cheating. I am, but it's just to make this more efficient for y'all. The closing filter, the way that this is done is based on a structuring radius of whatever pixel you choose. The default is 10 pixels. And the way that the closing filter works is it works based on the pixel intensity. So what we're doing is we are finding pixels at their bright points. And what we're doing is with the structuring radius, we're creating a burst out of those brighter pixels. Well, what the morphologic closing filter is doing is it's creating a burst out of those pixels per bright pixel, I guess. And as that's happening, it can blend together with other stronger pixels. So if you think of it as, I can move this over. As we look here, we're seeing a lot of intensity in this pixel here and this pixel here. So what we're doing with the closing filter is we're creating a structuring radius of 10 pixels surrounding the bright pixels. And so as they grow, as that happens, we're seeing a dilation. And as that dilation occurs, other bright pixels will be kind of meshed with it. And so the second piece is the erosion. And so when we erode away the less bright pixels, it's creating a stark contrast. It's a little difficult to explain, but essentially if we have a marker here, whoops, let me make that a little bit bolder. If we have a marker here and a marker here to designate those bright pixels, what we're saying is we're creating a 10 pixel radius around this one and around this one. And as we get closer to the kind of midpoints of where they meet, it's going to take those bright pixels and combine them. And then when we start the erosion process, we're going to look for the background and those dark pixels. And because these have been blended together, they've been closed together, it can't disperse that. It's going to keep that as a closed piece. So when we bring in our, I'll close this, when we bring in our closed filter, we can see that in that area, I think we were right here, some of those pixels have been blurred together and the intensity of that staining has been pushed just a little bit. So the Morphologic closing filter is a way to close smaller sections that might be created, whether there's a little punctate staining happening, if there's a varicose spot, those smaller sections are going to be kind of more attributed to that filter. Similarly, we have a vessel filter, and they do work in a similar fashion. However, the vessel filter is based on a sensitivity and an edge clearance rather than just a structuring radius. So what we're doing with this vessel filter is we're using the sensitivity as a control amount of signal, or it's looking at the amount of signal necessary for an object to be selected as part of the foreground structure. So what we're doing as we're creating this is first we're looking at this edge clearance and we're creating a buffer zone from the boundary of our image stack in 3 dimensions. Then based on that kind of 15 pixel buffer that we've created, we're going to start looking for objects that are saturated and in our foreground. The way we do that is we want to find the edges of the vessels. Any edge structure is going to be found, and those are going to be hard-lined edges. And from there, the algorithm is going to take place, and it's going to try and close and fill in everything between those edges as best as it can, while simultaneously looking for the background. And it's going to create that stark contrast between what is filtered in the foreground, and it's going to fill that in as nicely as it can. And then the background will be kind of disparaged from there. So because they are so similar, I just want to take a quick look at the original data in comparison to the closing filter while comparing that to the vessel filter. So if we look first at our original data, we can see that areas like this in the back, this vessel is fairly hollow and the edges aren't quite being found. There's some varicose spots happening and the staining isn't prominently there in all of the vessels. When we apply the closing filter, what we're doing, once again, is we're looking to create those kind of bursts out from those brighter pixels to create a closed environment in smaller areas. So here we can see that it did a nice job of creating a firm center for most of this unfilled vessel. But for the vessel where the edges were a bit trickier to complete and it was much more dispersed with staining, there's still some gaps and there's still some unfilled edges here. And as we look through the image, there are some varicose spots that still remain. And that's because we're not taking into account the edges, we're taking just the pixels themselves. So when we compare the closing filter to the vessel filter, we can see, I'm going to look at this spot in particular, we can see that the edges are nice and sharp now. The staining has made its way prominently throughout the whole vessel. And as we look through the remainder of the vasculature, a lot of those varicose spots have started to fill in much more uniformly to create a nice filled staining for the algorithms to follow. The reason that you would want to apply the vessel filter rather than the closing filter in some scenarios, for those working in vasculature, the vessel filter will do a nice job of, one, finding the edges of your vessels and then filling in everything from there. And two, it's going to do a nice job of creating a nice stark contrast between foreground and background. Whereas the closing filter is going to do a better job of filling in those smaller areas that might be created due to a puncta, or not a puncta, just punctate staining occurring, or if there's some sort of varicose spot. For those of us who aren't working in vasculature, one reason to apply the closing filter might be if you have gaps in your staining, or if you have hollow somas that are appearing in the 2D or in 3D, I guess. But when we look in 2D, if we can see hollowness in the soma, if that staining hasn't completely filled it in, it's going to do a nice job of creating those bursts of saturation in the pixels. So that way we can close the soma a little bit more and have a nice full reconstruction in the three-dimensional environment. A reason to use the vessel filter in non-vascular imaging, once again, would be if there seems to be a hollow structure where the algorithm isn't quite picking up the branches, or if there is just punctate staining throughout where you need to create a more uniform staining. That's where the vessel filter would come into play there for those who are not in the vascular research field. And lastly, we have our Golgi filter that I'd like to show. Golgi is always a troublesome labeling agent. It's tricky, it's a little messy, and it always sort of leads to these blurring issues when we get to the three-dimensional aspect of our image data. There's some blurring. As we look in the XY perspective, we can see that these spines are very prominently stained, but as we zoom in closer, there is a bit of blurring that happens as we move through the image stack as it's being acquired. That will help, or that won't help. That will result in some difficult detections for our spine algorithms and the detections that happen there. So in order to remedy that, we do have a Golgi filter. When I go to batch filter, add images to filter, select from computer, I can once again choose the image that I'd like to apply the filter to. I'll go back to the configuration wrench. I'll select my filter type and go to Golgi. Similar to that vessel filter, the Golgi filter is using the same sensitivity. So that's used to control the amount of signal necessary for an object to be selected as a part of the foreground structure. Sensitivity in this sense is really looking at the foreground. So if there are structures that are a little, I'll say a little more weakly labeled, you can raise the sensitivity past 100. What that's going to do is it's going to allow more of the original image data to be picked up by that Golgi filter. And in accordance, it's going to ignore it as we sort of blast out the background to create a more white and stark contrast here to remedy this kind of smearing that happens. The edge clearance setting is going to remain the same. We're looking to create a boundary for our edges of our image stack. And so now when I bring in our Golgi filtered image, we can look at the original data here in the 3D environment. And then as I turn off the original image, that filtered image will appear for us. And here we can see a nice stark contrast between the foreground and background. And from here, we can start to begin to reconstruct our image stacks with the automatic mode, user guided mode, or even smart manual if that's something that you would like to do. A few things to keep in mind while you're working on applying these image filters. This is not an exact science in the sense that one setting will not apply for every single image that we come across. Some images are going to be more prominently labeled, while others are going to be more dimly labeled. You can acquire an image stack where the saturation is pushed a little bit further in some scenarios than in others, and that changes on image to image. So when we do go to the batch filter configuration and we do select a filter to apply, a lot of the times when we look at the sensitivity, like in Golgi and in Vessel, or when we look at the in vivo filter and we look at the band count or displacement, it's really going to vary between images or image rounds even. Let me walk myself back a little bit. If you keep a similar technique for acquiring your image stacks, there's a likelihood that the same sensitivity setting should be applied to the animals that you're imaging. However, if you return a month later and you have new image data, it doesn't necessarily mean that 100% sensitivity will be the same when it's applied to your data from March as it is to August. And that's all depending on how the image has been acquired. Similarly, one sensitivity that we provide as the default may not work for your image right away. This can be a little bit of a guessing game to begin, but once you find the setting that works best for your image set, that's when you can start to apply it to multiple images at a time, and that's where this becomes more of a batch feature. We can add as many images to this batch filter as we'd like. However, it does take up time. Once you move from one, it doesn't simultaneously image or filter all of them at once. It will do it one image at a time. So please keep that in mind, that if you have 10 images, it will start to work on the first image, and as it's concluding, it will start to begin the second. They don't simultaneously filter all at once. Those were the 5 filters that they are the 5 filters that we have. It's the brief demonstration that I wanted to show is essentially done with that being said. It doesn't look like we have any questions that have come in during this time. If you do have any questions, please feel free to type those away right now. Essentially, the takeaway that I want people to have with this is your image data that you've acquired took time to create. You're going through all the necessary steps to generate your data so that you can start to work with your experiment and collect your quantitative results. If you want to apply these image filters, it's always welcomed. It's nice to be able to further the kind of exactness or ease the frustration of reconstruction, especially when you apply these filters. We do have a fantastically written help page here. If you do click on this blue question mark, it will bring you directly to our online help page, where each filter is provided at the bottom and what the settings do and how they work. So please, if you'd like more information about the exactness of each filter, feel free to go to there. As I wrap up now, there is a couple of things that I'd like to share. The first is the return of our NeuroArt contest, I guess. It essentially, due to COVID-19, a lot of customers, a lot of people were unable to access their labs and microscopes, and we suspended the contest. We're really excited to announce that the resumption of the NeuroArt image contest will begin again in September, the 1st of September to be exact. So we're happy to say that you can start entering your images again starting next month. The beautiful background I have here is one of our NeuroArt submissions. Blanked on that for a second, but we love getting these. They're beautiful images, and please feel free to start sending those in right away. And with that, I'm going to finish up by saying thank you, as always, for joining the webinar session. If you had a question that you weren't able to ask at this time, please feel free to visit our forum page as an extra resource to hopefully get the answers you're looking for. Thank you again for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and I look forward to the next webinar that we have. Thank you, and have a great day.